Welcome to Party Street. Today we are going to discuss about Investiture Controversy. After the decline of the Western Roman Empire, investiture was performed by members of the ruling nobility, despite theoretically being a task of the church. It was known as lay investiture. Many bishops and abbots were themselves part of the ruling nobility. Given the most members of the European nobility practiced primogeniture and willed their titles of nobility to the eldest surviving male heir, surplus male siblings often sought careers in the upper levels of the church hierarchy. This was particularly true where the family may have established a proprietary church or abbey on their estate. Since a substantial amount of wealth and land was usually associated with the office of the bishop or abbot, the sale of church offices, a practice known as simony, was an important source of income for leaders among the nobility, who themselves owned the land and by charity allowed the building of churches. Emperors had been heavily relying on bishops for their secular administration, as they were not hereditary or quasi-hereditary nobility with family interests. They justified their power by the theory of the divine right of kings. The rise of the popes as secular princes was matched by the moral decline of the church in Western Europe. This moral decline affected the monasteries as much as it did the bishoprics and parishes. In 1073, Pope Gregory VII, a man linked to the Cluniac order, was elected. In 1075, Pope Gregory VII composed the Dictatus Papae, though this was not published at that time, cataloging principles of his Gregorian reforms. One clause asserted that the Pope held the exclusive power to depose an emperor. It declared that the Roman Church was founded by God alone, that the papal power, the auctoritas of Pope Gelasius, was the sole universal power. In particular, a council held in the Lateran Palace from 24 to 28 February the same year decreed that the Pope alone could appoint or depose churchmen or move them from section to section. Gregory made very clear his view that the Pope, as God's vice-regent on earth, had authority over that of all secular rulers. Nobility, he claimed the right to depose emperors and kings, to release subjects from their oaths of obedience to a ruler who disobeyed him, and the right to try all serious disputes between secular rulers. Naturally, the rulers of Western Europe viewed Gregory's claims with alarm. If implemented in full, kings and emperors would be left with only a remnant of their royal power. The issue which caused them the most immediate anxiety, however, was regarding the investiture of bishops, as these were such important figures at the national and local levels. To lose control over them would have meant a serious diminution of power. The clash between papacy and secular rulers in medieval Europe is therefore known as the Investiture Controversy. By this time, Roman Emperor Henry IV was no longer a child, and he continued to appoint his own bishops. He reacted to this declaration by sending Gregory VII a letter in which he withdrew his imperial support of Gregory as Pope in no uncertain terms. The latter was headed Henry, king not through usurpation, but through the holy ordination of God, to Hildebrand, at present not pope, but false monk. It called for the election of a new pope. His letter ends, I, Henry, king by the grace of God, with all of my bishops, say to you, come down, and is often quoted with and to be damned throughout the ages, which is a latter addition. The situation was made even dearer when Henry IV installed his chaplain Tedald, a Milanese priest, as Bishop of Milan, when another priest of Milan, Atto, had already been chosen in Rome by the Pope. In 1076, Gregory responded by excommunicating Henry and deposed him as German king, releasing all Christians from their oath of allegiance. Enforcing these declarations was a different matter, but the advantage gradually came to be on the side of Gregory VII. German princes and the aristocracy were happy to hear of the king's deposition. They used religious reasons to continue the rebellion started at the First Battle of Langensalza in 1075 and to seize royal holdings. Aristocrats claimed local lordships over peasants and property, built forts which had previously been outlawed, and built up localized fiefdoms to secure their autonomy from the empire. This combination of factors forced Henry IV to back down, as he needed time to marshal his forces to fight the rebellion. In 1077, he traveled to Canossa in northern Italy, where the Pope was staying in the castle of Countess Matilda to apologize in person. The Pope was suspicious of Henry's motives and did not believe he was truly repentant. As penance for his sins and echoing his own punishment of the Saxons after the First Battle of Langensalza, he wore a hair shirt and stood barefoot in the snow in what has become known as the Walk to Canossa. Gregory lifted the excommunication. But the German aristocrats, whose rebellion became known as the Great Saxon Revolt, were not as willing to give up their opportunity and elected a rival king, Rudolf von Rennfeld. 3 years later, Pope Gregory declared his support for Rudolf von Rennfeld, and then on the Lenten Synod of 7th March 1080 excommunicated Henry IV again. In turn, Henry called a council of bishops at Brixen that proclaimed Gregory illegitimate. The internal revolt against Henry effectively ended the same year, however, when Rudolf von Rennfeld died. Though the immediate crisis passed, but Pope Gregory's successors maintained his stance, and in the early 12th century the secular rulers of Western Europe one by one came to terms. A compromise was reached which varied from place to place, but which broadly gave both popes and rulers an involvement in a bishop's appointment, with the king confirming him in his secular positions and the pope confirming him in his spiritual role. The Holy Roman Emperors were the last to reach such an agreement at the Concordat of Worms in 1122. By the terms of the agreement, the election of bishops and abbots in Germany was to take place in the emperor's presence or his legates as judge, without violence between potentially disputing parties, free of bribes, thus retaining to the emperor a crucial role in choosing these great territorial magnates of the empire. But absent a dispute, the canons of the cathedral were to elect the bishop, monks were to choose the abbot. Beyond the borders of Germany, in Burgundy and Italy, the election would be handled by the church without imperial interference. By this time, a long period of civil war had gravely damaged their authority throughout their large realm, tilting the Holy Roman Empire along the road to being a collection of virtually independent states rather than a single cohesive realm. The Gregorian reforms of the Church brought about a marked improvement in the moral tone of the Church. The crudest forms of lay interference in the appointment of bishops disappeared. The sale of church offices more or less ceased for the time being, and the priesthood adopted celibacy as a universal practice. However, at the local level, parish priests were still often appointed by lay lords, and even in the case of bishops, the rules of election were so ambiguous that kings were able to manipulate them with ease. In any case, it suited the popes to have bishops who had the ear of the kings. This put them in a good position to influence secular rulers to the church's advantage. The ending of the Investiture Controversy certainly did not mean the withdrawal of papal claims to limit secular rulers' powers over the church. The church insisted on its right to try clergy in its own courts, and this led to a violent clash in England between the King Henry II, reigned 1158 to 1189, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas of Becket. This ended with the murder of the Archbishop in 1170. The scandal that this caused meant that Henry had to drop all attempts to bring the clergy under the control of royal courts. The kings of France, meanwhile, had adroitly allied themselves with the popes, claiming that the church's interests lay in supporting royal power against the power of the obviously less devout local magnates. The French kings emerged from this period with their royal authority strengthened. When a pope eventually insisted on the church's right to not pay tax to a secular ruler, it was too late. The French king Philip the Fair had the pope roughed up 1296, an experience from which that pope never recovered. This episode marked the end of active attempts by popes to assert superiority over secular rulers. The various privileges the church had obtained were a source of irritation to secular rulers and their officials, but they had learned by and large to live with them. Monarchs still had much influence on the church within the borders of their realms. We have seen that they could manipulate bishops' elections to their advantage, and bishops and abbots still possessed vast estates which had feudal obligations attached to them. Although they mostly no longer had to pay homage to kings for these lands, bishops and abbots still had to fulfill the duties of a vassal to a lord in respect of them. Churchmen made up the brightest and best of royal advisors and officials, and an additional benefit to secular rulers was that they could be paid out of revenues from church offices they held and not from the royal purse. In the early 14th century, the papacy was about to enter a long period of decline. Since the mid-13th century, violent instability within the city of Rome had forced popes to base themselves elsewhere. In 1309, a pope established himself and his court at Avignon of France. Here he and his successors resided until 1378 under the thumb of the French king. This brought the papacy into disrepute. Urs was to follow. Between 1378 and 1418, there were two, then three rival popes, each supported by different countries. These shenanigans could only undermine the prestige of the papacy and of the Church as an institution. For the Church, despite the fact that the original reform movement in the 11th century had been motivated by a desire to free the Church from secular entanglements, the effect of the Investiture Controversy and subsequent attempts to impose its will on emperors and kings was to make it more, not less, entangled with secular politics. As the leaders of the Church became more political, so their spiritual authority declined. Even when schisms were headed and a single pope was reigned from Rome, he and his successors did little to restore the moral integrity and spiritual force of the papacy. So this is the end of our today's discussion. Subscribe our channel and like our video and comment. Listen to our podcast episodes. Follow our official Facebook page, Twitter handle and Instagram. For any query, feel free to mail us. For details, see the description.